Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. I'm going to talk to you today about your paper for this course and the fact that I've changed the topic for this course for your paper assignment for this summer. Perhaps for future reference if anyone takes the course in the future, but certainly for your group. Wanted to make it easier and a little bit more straightforward. So this recording is specifically about the topic question and the prompt and all the little nooks and crannies that are in it, and try how best to explain how to approach it. So let me read what the the topic actually says. What was the key legal strategy for achieving an end to Jim Crow and legal segregation in the South developed by African Americans in the 1930s and 1940s? Why was this strategy more successful than anything else tried by blacks before the 1930s, e.g. the Plessy v. Ferguson decision? What three key and related events occurred during and after World War II that laid the groundwork for the early civil rights movement in the years after the war outside the courtroom, events not directly tied but relevant to this legal strategy? What I'm asking you to do in this paper is to talk about the civil rights movement before the official civil rights movement started in the mid-1950s, before the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, before the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, before the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King Jr. as its head. I'm asking you to think about the generation before all of this happens for a couple of reasons. Number one, civil rights and fighting for civil rights for African Americans has been an ongoing struggle. From the moment African Americans came to this country, still struggle now, of course. So there's no reason to think that the civil rights movement only happened between 1954 and 1968, or between 1954 and 1972, however you define it, right? That what we call the civil rights movement is the most successful part of an ongoing struggle that African Americans have always had. So then becomes the question of, well, what happened during the 1930s and 1940s? What was the legal strategy? How does it tie to key events? So what you really need to be doing is thinking about two things. You're thinking about what ordinary African Americans were doing, or other prominent African Americans were doing, who weren't civil rights attorneys, who weren't going to court to try to fight separate but equal Jim Crow segregation. We're thinking about other things besides how best to attack the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, how best to dismantle all the legal barriers to equal rights for African Americans, and how to deal with other issues around African Americans in terms of employment or housing, in terms of being able to, coexist or exist in the segregated society, right? So you're looking at two things here. You're looking at the actual strategy, right? The strategy that leads to the Brown decision in 1954, and some of the steps or key court decisions that were involved as part of that strategy. So that's part of what you're doing here. But the other part of what you're doing is, okay, what are some key events? Events that are not in the courtroom, that also are that are both perpendicular, meaning that they're somehow related to the legal strategy, but yet parallel at the same time, meaning that lawyers aren't necessarily involved in this process. And your answers can't be something that happened 2 years before Brown. You have to look at the 30s and 40s. So what's happening in the 1930s? You have to understand the larger context of what's happening in the 1930s, right? So the Great Depression, right? And how the Great Depression has a differential impact on African Americans versus whites, for instance, might be something to think about in terms of employment or housing or schooling or whatnot. In the 1940s, you're thinking about things like the run-up to World War II and how African Americans are treated in terms of employment and housing and schooling, but also in terms of the military. So you're looking at key events that might involve those things as well, right? And so what you're thinking about are, and this is where the lecture notes help, I talk about all these things in the lecture notes. So look at the lecture notes. Spend some time with them. Don't just look at the readings for the OERs, from the OERs, and think that that's going to be sufficient. So look at those lecture notes. Look at the bibliography and see if there are any things around World War II or the Great Depression that might pertain to African Americans that might give you some of these events, right? And some of these events aren't necessarily big events. They're not nationally known events. Heck, a good portion of African American history is nationally known, as I've written recently, so that's fairly obvious in some respects that were not that obvious, right? So you're thinking about small things that might, as well as big things that might be helpful in answering this question. Here are some things I don't want you to do in terms of answering this question, though. Do not, for instance, write a sentence, and this is some of the things I talk about in terms of do's and don'ts in the other video. No throwaway sentences. Don't start a sentence with what I just said earlier in this video, that say for instance, African Americans have always fought for civil rights in the United States. That's a throwaway sentence. That's not what this topic is about. I said this to give you a sense to think about the fact that civil rights is an ongoing issue, and so in order to get to 1954, in order to get to Brown, in order to get to the Montgomery bus boycott, there had to be things that were happening in the period before then, so that people were already in place to lead those movements, to be part of these events, to win these key court decisions, and so on and so forth. So you want to think more in terms of writing a sentence that actually addresses some of these questions. What was the key legal strategy? The key legal strategy that was developed in the 1930s to dismantle Jim Crow legal segregation was blah, 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 right? This strategy was more effective because X, Y, and Z. These events are related to the strategy. These three events, and you name those events, are related to the strategy because of A, B, and C. That's kind of what you want to write in terms of your introduction. You want to be more elaborate than what I just did, but you want to be to the point. You want to be able to say, this is essentially how I'm going to write this paper. And in the process of doing so, you're making the argument in writ large that the 1930s and 1940s are key to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Without these events that happened under the larger U.S. umbrella of the Great Depression and World War II and the run-up to World War II from the U.S. standpoint, African American activism doesn't lead to the things that happened after World War II, doesn't lead to the things that happened particularly in the 1950s and 60s. That's how you're putting this paper together. That's how you're going about this process. So make use of the lecture notes. Don't meander and throw away, verbiage and space in your paper on trying to basically explain that civil rights has always been an issue for African Americans, or what the Great Depression was all about, or what World War II was all about. That's not important. The important thing is to understand the generation, that what was going on in the generation before the official civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. The people involved, people's names we often might recognize or might not recognize, the events that were important, and so on. So that's the paper in a nutshell. I'm trying to keep it straightforward. It's pretty straightforward overall, but you want to, the other thing I would say before I close out this video is that you want to draw connections. So even though I've essentially given you the scaffolding for your introduction, the body of your paper has to draw connections between the legal strategy and what's going on in the courtroom with the events that are going on in the 30s and 40s that are key to sort of reigniting or igniting a mass movement, right? They're both critical. You need those court wins, but you also need to have activism on the ground as well. You want to draw the connections between the two of those things. So that's the other part of what I would emphasize in terms of this topic question and all the little nooks and crannies that are within it. Obviously, if you have any further questions, you can always post under Ask My Professor on Leo, or just simply send me an email at donald.collins@faculty.umuc.edu. I will post a follow-up video next week on citations and references and other formatting. So that's it. Contact me if you have any questions. Hopefully this is helpful.